This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by Stitcher Premium. If you haven't joined Stitcher Premium yet, now is the perfect time. It gets you completely ad-free episodes of hundreds of shows like Comedy Bang Bang, WTF with Mark Maron, and How Did This Get Made? You'll also get 21,000 hours of exclusive content with new exclusive originals like Marvel's Wolverine and Issa Rae's Fruit being launched every week for Stitcher Premium members. And when you listen to ad-free episodes in Stitcher Premium, your favorite podcasters get paid. Help support your favorite shows and join Stitcher Premium today. For a free month of listening, go to StitcherPremium.com and use the promo code FOOD. That's StitcherPremium.com and use promo code FOOD. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian and certified intuitive eating counselor, offering online courses and programs to help people all over the world make peace with food. Join me here every week as I talk with interesting people from all walks of life about their relationships with food and their bodies.
I remember I was teething, little gums bleeding, cried every evening, it was all about eating. When I became a teen, it was all about beefing. Now I'm ready for the world, trying to sink my teeth in, stacking extra cheese.
Hey there, welcome to episode 154 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with the amazing activist and author Jes Baker for her second appearance on the pod. We talked about her new book, Landwhale, and what it was like to write that, the value in all kinds of coping mechanisms and why we need to stop demonizing so-called emotional eating, the transmission of body negativity, body dysmorphia, and chronic dieting through family members, the difference between intellectually understanding health at every size and actually integrating its practices into our lives and our recovery journeys, and so much more. It's a really great one. I can't wait to share it with you in just a moment. I think you're going to love it. But first, I'll answer this week's listener question, which is from a listener named Barbara, who writes, "Hi, Christy. I love your podcast. I'm going back and listening to old ones because I just found you. I just heard the one where you interview Evelyn Tribole. I gravitated toward that one because I'm learning to eat intuitively by using her book. You mentioned at one point that your family used to shame you if you needed to eat between meals. I've been dealing with the same thing my whole life. I'm 37 and you'd think this shit would end at some point. I don't live in the same state as my family, but when I visit, there's this whole get with the program, we're eating in an hour, can't you wait vibe. More importantly, the message has been implanted in my brain, so even when I'm 4 hours away from the parents, I'll get anxious that if I don't finish a meal and I get hungry a couple hours later, people will judge me if they see me going to the fridge again, whether it's at work or at home with my very supportive husband or wherever. I try to challenge every food police comment with a nurturer and ally kind of comment, and my therapist has taught me to be kind to myself over the last 10 years. But I'm finding that the eating experience is really marred by this particular voice. Will it go away if I keep on challenging it? Did you do anything in addition to override those parental voices? I say, you can eat whenever you get hungry again, sweetie, but I don't always believe myself. Secondly, I'm finding that eating completely without distraction is too intense. I'm all for being in the present moment in general, and I do the whole yoga, meditation, Buddhism thing, but when it comes to eating, I find that my anxiety and my perfectionism are so amplified. Working with my anxiety while learning to gauge my hunger and fullness and satisfaction levels just feels too overwhelming. I'm finding that if I give myself just one distraction, like a TV show, a book, or another person, then my eating experience is a little less fraught. I know there's not supposed to be a right or wrong, but what do you think about this? What is your experience with totally undistracted versus just a little distracted eating? Thank you so much for your time and for your very smart podcast." So thanks, Barbara, for that really nice, juicy question. And before I answer, just my usual disclaimer that these answers are for informational and educational purposes only and aren't a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice. So yeah, I totally feel you on having been shamed about needing to eat between meals by your parents. And it can really take a lot of effort to get that shaming voice to go away. So just want to empathize with you on that and send a lot of compassion your way. But it sounds like you're really early on in the intuitive eating journey. And so I definitely want to reassure you that when you keep challenging that voice, it really does get quieter and quieter. So, now for me, when I'm away from my parents, which is most of the time because I live 3,000 miles away from them, I don't don't have that voice come up at all. And when I'm around them, sometimes maybe it does come up like literally from them, but I challenge any snack shaming directly, and to the point where it really doesn't come up that much anymore because they know all about the work that I do, and I'm really open in talking about how harmful it is to make comments about people's eating or weight. So they're starting to really get it. And I think that really my parents and all of our parents are just like everyone else in diet culture. They've been brainwashed by diet culture like we all have. And it takes a lot of effort for anyone in this culture to unbrainwash themselves, which is why I do this podcast and offer online courses and coaching. And that's why I'm writing a book, and why Evelyn Dribbley wrote her book, and all my amazing colleagues who come on the show are out there doing their work, because it takes a ton of resources and a ton of voices and just a steady drip of new information and support to challenge those ingrained diet culture beliefs. So all that is to say, I think you're totally on the right track to get to life beyond diet culture, even if your parents aren't. And definitely the key to your own healing is to keep challenging those critical voices. And just like you're already doing, it sounds like, with a firm and self-compassionate voice that sticks up for you and sticks up for your needs. It's like reparenting yourself, and I can just tell from the way that you phrased your question and your self-compassionate response to yourself that you really are doing this and you're practicing it already. So keep at it. It really is a practice, and just know that it takes time, but trust that the effort really will pay off in the form of a decrease in those negative voices over time. And when you're actually around your parents, I would say you can try speaking up to them, or even just, if you're not ready for that yet, because it does take a while to work up to that, just exchanging a look or a hand squeeze with your husband for solidarity can go a long way. And then when you are ready to say something to them directly, I think saying something, neutral could be good as a start, like, well, everyone's body is different and I need to eat right now, just kind of keeping it, not getting too pointed, but like, well, different strokes kind of vibe, right? Or you could go in a more direct, approach, like, please don't shame me for my food needs right now, which is, something that might be better if they're open to conversations about stuff that's bothering you. And you could try maybe bringing it up sometime later as well, like not in the heat of the moment, but a time when everyone is calm and you can have a dialogue about it and really talk about how those comments make you feel. I know those kinds of direct conversations can be super hard to have, and some families really aren't open to that. Some families have like an unspoken rule that we just don't talk about our feelings. But if yours is somewhat open to that, at least, then I think it's definitely worth a shot. And I think for me, I'm really lucky that my family is one that can tolerate a little bit of talking about our feelings, at least to a point. There's still a little bit of that unspoken rule there, but my mom's a therapist, so like we kind of, do speak the language of therapy a little bit in my family, and talking to them directly about their role in my food issues was a really important part of the healing process for both my own relationship with food and my relationship with them around food. So I think that, if your family seems open to that, or, you can crack a door a little bit, I think having a conversation with them about it could really go a long way towards minimizing some of the triggers that you experience when you're around them. You might have to, as I'm always saying on the podcast, you might have to like remind them again and again, because oftentimes people don't even notice when they're saying something that's really diety, or when they're shaming someone else for their food choices. Like, again, diet culture is so ingrained in most of us that it's just really hard to recognize it. And so you might have to be like, hey, remember that conversation we had last time I was here about the food shaming? That was kind of a food shamey comment, just wanted to point that out, right? So you might have to do that a few times. And that's one of the hard parts about setting boundaries, I think, is that just setting the boundary is hard enough. Like, you have to work up your courage to do that. And then you have to enforce the boundary. You have to point it out when somebody's violating the boundary. And that can be a real challenge too. So, give yourself the time and space to do that. Give yourself a lot of compassion when you are ready and decide to do that, because it's not easy, but know that you're not alone, and that setting boundaries really is important for healing your relationship with food and your relationship with them. In terms of the second part of your question about eating without distractions, I would say you definitely don't have to eat entirely undistracted. I don't really recommend that. I don't think that that's really possible for most of us anyway, because humans have been bonding over food for millennia. And I think we're very much meant to be like, quote unquote, distracted by other people while we eat, at least. And the same goes for other things like eating while watching TV or a movie or a baseball game or while reading a book, all of those things are also really long-standing traditions in our culture. And I think the only reason that quote unquote distraction while eating gets a bad rap is because diet culture tells us that we're going to quote unquote overeat if we don't pay exquisite attention to our every bite, right? That's sort of a new guise of diet culture within the last 10 to 15 years. I don't think that distracted eating necessarily got such a bad rap before that. But I think that's sort of a new manifestation of the wellness diet, which is what I like to call this, sneaky new version of diet culture that presents itself as wellness. So I think that, this idea that you're supposed to be totally undistracted while eating is a part of the wellness diet and is, a part of diet culture and diet mentality. So not to be trusted, right? The reality is that intuitive eaters can still stay in touch with our body's cues, even while engaging our mind in another way. So doing other things while you're eating doesn't really affect our ability to eat intuitively. It might take you a little while to get the hang of it with intuitive eating. And so paying a little more attention early on in the process sometimes can help in some cases, which I'll get to in a minute. But I would say, for me now, 8 years or so after having relearned intuitive eating, I still eat lunch at my desk pretty much every day while I'm working. And I take bites between writing or reading articles or doing other tasks. And I never question what my body is telling me. I still am able to trust my hunger and fullness cues, my satisfaction. Of course, I would say that it can bring a lot more pleasure to eat with a more pleasant kind of distraction, like conversation with, my husband or another friend or dining companion or something, or reading a book just for fun. So I try to make sure to have those pleasant eating experiences too, and not just be working through every meal or snack. I will also say that for anyone who's really overwhelmed with disordered voices in their head while they're eating, like many of the clients I've worked with who are coming from a long history of chronic dieting or eating disorders, and maybe you, Barbara, in the place that you're at in your relationship with food, distraction is actually the best medicine for being able to tune out those voices and just get eating done. And if you're in the early stages of recovery from disordered eating and you find that those critical voices get really loud when you're eating, especially when you're eating things that you like, that used to be off limits in diet culture when you were dieting, it's really so helpful to have a good long stretch of time when you're just distracting yourself with something interesting and pleasant while you're eating so that you can just eat and break the cycle of listening to those disordered voices and doing what they tell you. And then later on, as you get further into recovery or further into your intuitive eating journey, you can experiment with challenging those voices and talking back to them as you eat. But, that's really difficult at first, especially if they're really loud and especially if you're just dipping your toe into recovery for the first time. So often that really takes quite a while to get to a place where you can, lower the distraction level while you're eating. And in the meantime, just let yourself be in that place for as long as you need. Let yourself be in the place of distracting yourself with something pleasant and mind entertaining so that you don't have to ruminate about your food as you eat. And then when you get further into recovery, if and when you're ready to tune in a bit more during the eating experience, it can be nice to spend a quick moment to just pay attention to the taste and the texture, the colors, the flavors, the temperature of your food, all the sensory elements of food in order to increase your pleasure. And that's really the only reason I would recommend bringing a little more awareness to your eating experience at that point after you've gone, a ways into recovery, is because it can help increase pleasure. And pleasure is such a great antidote to diet culture. Diet culture really robs you of your enjoyment of food and, satisfaction and pleasure in life in general, which is why I call it the life thief. And when you reclaim your pleasure, you're basically giving a big middle finger to diet culture and declaring that you deserve to experience pleasure and satisfaction because guess what? You absolutely do. So you deserve pleasure, and taking pleasure in food is a great experience, and that's something that's available to you when you're ready down the line. And, that could mean maybe turning down the volume on the distractions a little bit. But even then, even when you're tuning in to increase your pleasure, you definitely don't have to have a completely silent, undistracted experience, because that's kind of austere. That actually doesn't sound very pleasurable to me. So, you can absolutely still be watching TV or talking to a friend or reading a book or whatever you want to be doing during the meal and still tuning in a little bit more to increase your pleasure. And I would just say when you're ready to do that, all it takes is like taking a deep breath and just spending a moment trying to notice the delicious qualities in your food every once in a while, like as you're eating, sort of going back and forth and trying to savor both the food and the conversation, or the food and the TV show you're watching, right? Or whatever else you're doing while you're eating, savoring the whole experience. So it doesn't just mean sitting there silently eating your food and being like, I must only think about food right now. That's not pleasure. That's not life. I would argue that's not even intuitive eating. That's really the wellness diet, or the mindful eating diet, or whatever you want to call it, right? So don't do that thing that's the diet in disguise. You can absolutely have other things going on while you eat. And, when you're ready to tune in a little bit more to the flavors and textures and pleasure of food, you can do that knowing that you have full permission to also still have something else going on at the same time. So I hope that helps. And that was a great question. If you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you want a whole library of answers from me to help you master intuitive eating, plus a chance to ask me any question you want, join my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. It has so much great content, multimedia content, helping teach you the principles of intuitive eating and put them into practice in your life, which, as I'm going to talk about with Jes Baker in just a minute, is really where the rubber meets the road of intuitive eating. Like, that's the tricky part, not just knowing this information about intuitive eating and health at every size, but actually putting it into practice and living it in your life. So that's what this course is designed to help you do. It's designed to really help you let go of dieting and disordered eating, put intuitive eating into practice so that you can go on and do bigger and better things with your life. Because let's be real, like, nobody wants to spend their whole day thinking about food and their bodies and obsessing about every food choice. Like, that is just such a waste of our time on this planet. And, we've got so much bigger and better things to do here. So I want to help you do that. I want to help you make food just an easy breezy thing that is a pleasurable and enjoyable part of your life, that helps you get things done, that helps fuel your great life, but that's just one small aspect of your life and something that you don't have to think that much about. So if you're ready to do that and leave diet culture behind once and for all so that you can reclaim your life, learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. And now, without any further ado, let's go talk to Jes Baker. So, Jes, welcome back to the podcast. It's so good to talk with you again. I'm really excited to catch up on everything you've been up to in the past 9 months since we last spoke. And it's funny that it's 9 months because I feel like you've birthed a book in that time.
It definitely feels like it. Thanks for having me back. I enjoyed the first time. I know we're going to enjoy the second time around too.
Yeah, me too. It was great. I'm excited for people to listen to that. If they haven't already, they can check that out at episode 112, and I'll put links to that in the show notes and stuff too, so people can hear your original story. But I'd love to just dive into what's been going on for you since then and what the process of writing your latest book was like.
Okay.
Your first book was more service-based and, not as personal. And this is a memoir. Your book, A Landwhale, is very personal. And so I'm curious to hear what that process was like of writing such a personal book.
It felt completely different. I've done a lot of hard things in life. And I think that this book is probably one of the hardest, if not the hardest. And I say that because it really was uncharted territory for me. And so when you're writing something so personal, like I had revelations throughout the book dealing with my past and of course then future and my present and digging under trauma and then going 7 layers deeper and then, kind of being forced to put it into words. It was not just a book, it was a life project for me. I think I was just mentioning to you earlier, I feel like I aged 10 years while writing it. I feel 10 years older. I don't know how that's possible, but it did a lot of healing, I think. I opened a lot of old wounds, and when you do that, that allows for some more healing to happen. The first book I wrote, Things No One Will Tell Fat Girls, was a little easier in its format, in the content, because what I was writing was revelations that I knew to be true, that I had been writing about for 4 years already. I had been bouncing them off of colleagues and friends and the internet and readers and having all these conversations in real life at lectures. And so I was very familiar with what I was writing. And with Landwhale, I kind of decided that I wanted to write a book about my body and all of the different ways that feeling a little emotional. All of the ways that my body has influenced my life. And I think that I was not quite prepared. I don't know if you can ever be prepared, but I was very unprepared for what I would find out about myself. There's chapters that I didn't even pitch in my proposal that ended up in there because I discovered new things. And, it's an imperfect book and it's very messy and the writing's very messy. I really wanted it to be like this flawless, perfectly executed piece of writing because I love books for that. They're a whole conversation. But the reality is that life is messy and the world is messy, and where I'm at in my life will always be a journey. And so the chapters are organized, but other than that, what's inside is just kind of everything I've been discovering about myself and the world, put as eloquently as I can, sometimes more eloquently at times than others.
I love it. I think it's so well written and has a real energy to it that, I think probably speaks to the fact that you were going through the process as you were writing it, because you can feel that. When I read it, I was telling you off mic, I can't put it down. I have to put it down for life reasons, but I don't want to put it down. But I want to just spend all my time reading this book because it's so it just pulls you along. I feel like it really flows and there's this energy there that I can feel. So I'm sure it felt messy, the process of writing it, but I feel like as a reader, it makes sense. It feels like a sort of organic movement, and I'm happy to just be on this river, floating along with it. So.
Oh, I love that. I had a lot of conversations with about a dozen people that I really respect, and about several of the different conversations that I have in the chapter. Most of it is obviously very, very, very personal stories. And some of it is kind of a conversation starter. I don't have the answers for questions that I pose. And I wanted to take some of those questions to other people that I really respect and feel are incredibly brilliant and wise. And one of those people was Ijoma Ulo, who I often talk about. But she did give me, instead of a dedication, in conversation, she said the most powerful thing for me that really drove me as I was writing. And it's something to the effect of, we have tried to prove our worthiness to the thin world for too long. If you're going to be brave for the fat people. So as I was writing, I found myself wanting to censor for safety, right? For emotional safety. I was already being so vulnerable in so many ways. But when I would pause and say, I don't know if I want the world to know that because, maybe I'll be made fun of for it, or somebody will look down on me, or this will be something that another person will take issue with. I really came back to kind of that sentiment and that core. And that what is something that I am truly proud of. I feel like in all of this writing in Landwhale, I was the most honest and transparent, authentic that I could possibly be. My agent is really sweet, and it's kind of macabre, but she was like, Jess, you have this skill of being able to open a vein and just let it flow, even though it's really painful. And so that's really what Landwhale, I think, encompasses. It's raw for me still. There's chapters that I just cried through. I had a friend come over, I'm on deadline having to write, and she comes over and I'm just crying all over my laptop, explaining to her what I'm writing about, and she helped me process it. Shout out to Jules. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, we all need those friends.
Yeah. So that's what Landwhale is. It's a hell of a mess, and that's okay with me. And I think one thing that anyone who's written a book knows as well is that, things change, and your thoughts and beliefs change daily, I hope, for everyone, because that means we're growing and learning. And so there's some things in there that might not be perfect, and in a year I would maybe think, I wish I wrote something different. I know more now, or I disagree with myself, but that's okay with me too, because I feel like I've accepted the fact that I'm a living, breathing, growing, progressing human. And ideally people will find validation, hopefully, maybe something that they felt they were alone in that they now know that they're not. And also, it starts some conversations for people that, we can agree and disagree, but let's talk about it. So that's kind of why Landwhale exists and how it came to be.
I love that. And I think that's so important to recognize too, that you're an evolving human being. Because I think there's this scary thing about putting something in print, and especially a book. It's not just a magazine that people are going to like maybe toss away after the month, but it's a book that's going to sit on people's shelves forever, potentially. But we're not that permanent as humans. Like our ideas aren't that permanent, right? Our personalities are always changing. Our ideas are always changing and evolving. And that's good, like you said. So just being aware that like even books are sort of ephemeral collections of someone's ideas at that point in time, and that, that person continued to evolve after they typed the last word in that book.
Yeah. And I hope we do. I really, really hope. I believe in a world where everything does change, because that means that we're learning and growing, and that's absolutely critical if we're going to become better people and make the world a better place.
Yeah, I so agree. I feel like that kind of change is essential for growth. And, I'm curious, when you talked about like crying over your laptop, the chapter that jumped into my mind when you were talking about that was the chapter about realizing that you weren't actually a fat kid. Like that chapter, I was crying. I was in an airplane reading it, and I was just like trying to conceal my sobs from my seatmate, and it just was incredibly moving because, this idea that you had this sort of self-conception given to you from the outside, and this body dysmorphia handed to you from the outside was really sad to me. And I'm curious if that was one of the chapters that brought so much up for you, or, if you
Oh, yeah, you nailed it. You nailed it. Definitely. And it's one of, it's like it's in the first 5 chapters that it's 2 different chapters. The initial proposal had a chapter called I Was a Fat Kid. And, I kind of like jauntily went over to my mom's house to look at scrapbooks. Grew up Mormon, so we have many, many scrapbooks. Scrapbooking was a hot thing, and I was flipping through them, and I'm feeling really emotional today. You caught me on a good day, Christy. I was flipping through them, and in short, essentially, I have a great memory of my childhood and details that sometimes I wonder if I remember more details than most people, but so I was fairly certain in my writing of this chapter that I was a fat kid. And as I was looking through the scrapbooks at my mom's house, I wasn't a fat kid. It was what it comes down to. I kept flipping through pages and pages and pages of pictures. And I don't know how to describe, I don't even have the words to describe my childhood body, but I was not fat. And I became chubby during puberty. And then, of course, my body continued to change. And as we know, a lot of things can contribute to our bodies changing. And one thing that I do realize, and that was taught to me by Dana of Be Nourished, is that our body doesn't really know the difference when it comes to food deprivation, whether it's because we don't have enough food physically in our house because we can't afford it, or if it's because we're dieting and starving our bodies. It doesn't really know the difference. And what I had realized that was continual is as a child, I grew up in poverty. And so there was constantly food deprivation and the sense of scarcity there. And then once I left that, I went straight into, they overlapped, of course, but I continued with diet culture. And so I've been living in a world of food scarcity my entire life. And I think that has a lot to do with where I'm at in my body today. But looking through those pictures back at my mom's house, it was just really shocking to me to find a very much not fat child, because I have all these vivid memories, and I also vividly remember living those memories as a fat child. It was my identity in a way. I lived my life through my body, through a fat child's body. So it was kind of a mind fuck, and I didn't really understand why. I called my mom over and I was like, Mom, did you know I wasn't a fat kid? And she was like, yeah, I know. And I was like, was this like something that everyone else knew except for me? And then I finally found a picture of me hitting puberty, and I was like, oh my God, there I am. That's like kind of the chubby self that I remember. And she was like, oh yeah, that's when you hit puberty. That's pretty normal. So I was just baffled. And that was my chapter on I'm a fat kid, but I wasn't. So there had to be follow-up, and it happened organically, having a conversation with my dad, who, we'll just say, was like emotionally estranged from my life for a really long time. And he had been in the hospital, still is, just had open heart surgery. It's continued since I've written this book, this fragility that I'm seeing in my dad. And, there's something about that makes you, I've always thought with my dad for many reasons and kept a distance. But, watching him kind of physically and in many other ways fade has been very tragic. And it really made me reevaluate the connection that I have within the walls that I've built between us. And so I've kind of been taking down those walls. We're having conversations. And while he was in the hospital, as I was writing this book, I called him and had this really interesting conversation. We really don't have serious conversations. And it was a very, very real one. And what I uncovered, I don't want to basically read you the book, but what I uncovered is I couldn't figure out why I felt like I was a fat kid when I wasn't. And what I realized is that my dad had body image issues of his own. And we know that in this society, kind of this masculine pride and power can come from money, positions of power, lots of different things. And also one of those things, though not as hugely highlighted, is body image. And he really couldn't control, he was also born into a poor home, given a hand of cards that he didn't really succeed with in all of the traditional ways. And so he turned to his body. So he's an obsessive dieter. In talking to my therapist, it's interesting to hear how different it is to learn diet culture from your father instead of your mother. Oftentimes it's the beauty myth is handed down from mother to daughter. I learned it from my dad. And so we had this conversation while he was in the hospital. And, I was like, we were breaking down walls. And I was like, Dad, I know that you hated me growing up. And I just wanted to let you know that, we're okay. Everything's okay now. And he's like, I didn't hate you. I just felt like you were lazy and it was my fault. And so I took it out on you. And I realized that it wasn't my fault. That it wasn't your fault, that it was mine. I just didn't know how to express at the time. And I was like, lazy. I was like, man, if I was anything, it would not be lazy. Because I grew up thinking anyone who is fat or has body image issues around this might understand. When you grow up thinking you're fat, compensating for your body, you excel in everything else. So I was like, brilliant student, head of everything, overachiever to the max. And so I was like, I was just a kid, first and foremost, but also I wasn't lazy, Dad. And then I realized it took me a minute. And it was this cryptic language that it was old and crude language that he just didn't know how to express. That what he said was essentially, you were fat. And I felt like it was my fault because to him, lazy and fat are the same thing still. And so I asked him and I was like, Dad, I knew you had problems and still do have problems with your body. Were you also afraid of being a failure if you had a fat kid? And he said, yes. And I finally understood where all of this body dysmorphia came from, as long as I can remember growing up. And that was it's so baffling to me, right? To live your life as a child. We just absorb what's around us. And sure, there were Disney movies and I read teen magazines and, all those other media things. But at home, I was being told, you are fat. Fat is bad. Fix yourself. Even when I wasn't those things. And so, that's just the opening chapters to growing up in Jes Baker's body. But that was really hard for me to write because it's still so raw and new. The interesting thing is I just had brunch with a friend in Seattle and they said, oh my God, I had something similar happen, where they weren't necessarily fat, but they were deemed the fat child. And so they grew up thinking of their body in one way when it was visibly something different. And that leads us to a lot of really theoretical conversations. But I don't think I'm the only one who's had this experience, but it's still new to me.
Yeah, I don't think you're the only one either. I've definitely heard that from a lot of people that, especially having a parent who has their own body image issues and just puts that on you in subtle or not so subtle ways can really affect your self-image for decades to come. But I think it's so powerful because, the fact that you had that experience while writing the book, I think made it feel like I could feel the rawness in it. And I could feel I'm just getting emotional even thinking about the fact that your dad, seeing him in this sort of new vulnerable place sort of led you to be able to have this honest conversation? And I don't know, I've been, my parents are aging as well. And sort of just every time I see them, I'm like, oh my God, like seeing the signs of them becoming more fragile too. It's really difficult. And then this idea that you had been writing about this stuff for such a long time and exploring body acceptance very publicly, but that your own self-image was still being colored by this childhood trauma, basically, of having body dysmorphia handed to you.
Which is the part that blows my mind, because it's not uncommon for us to have some elements of body dysmorphia because of the society we live in. But the fact that I've been digging, like, I have not just been passively like talking about fatness once in a while. Like, I've been digging and researching and speaking and writing about this for years. And it wasn't until recently that I uncovered this enormous piece of my history and identity. So that was just, whoa. That's why I know that Hewlett-Packard is a great laptop, because you can cry on it for weeks and it will still work. It will still work.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I love that. Yeah, no, I'm sure that experience, writing a memoir in general seems so fraught and so difficult, because you are, like you said, just really reopening those old wounds and going back there and kind of like rolling around in the stuff that shaped you and that gave you so many of the coping mechanisms that we all grow up with, sort of like formed around these wounds. It's like reopening them and sort of reconfiguring the shape of things. It's very difficult.
And you are shaping it. That's a really great way to put it. Like, you really are taking this universe around you of memories and feelings and thoughts and history, and you're shaping it. You're putting a container around it. And that's a really fascinating process.
And that it seems like, with your own relationship with food and your body, like what you talk about in the book about sort of starting to actually implement health at every size and also just connection with your own body in your life. It seems like you're starting to really reshape that stuff in your own life too, like behaviorally and sort of, mentally as well. Just how you think and relate to food and your own body is really changing.
It is. It's a really slow process. Of course it is. This is something that, like I said, we didn't have food growing up. I starved myself as I was a young adult. And so, I really haven't had any form of stability there. And so, yeah, it was eye-opening to realize that, knowing the research behind the health at every size model, I think is really wonderful. And they've expanded it since my last book to be even more inclusive, and it's beautiful the way they worded it. But it's my most fraught relationship, probably more even than with my father. So my body and my mind, it's connecting them has been very difficult because I didn't know how. And so I lecture about health at every size. I'm very educated in exactly how it works, all of the research behind it, why it's important. As someone who's worked in mental health, I see the value. And as someone who can understand how bodies work, I also see the value. But it's so different knowing it and implementing it, because we really, like, on a cellular level, my body resists these new ideas and concepts and behaviors because they're so foreign. And I'm still on a very long, I'm at the very beginning of this journey of connecting both my body and my mind to and finding a place of balance where they can both coexist.
Yeah. And I think that experience is really familiar to a lot of our listeners, like intellectually understanding HAES versus putting it into practice in your life and trusting that it's available to you personally, and sort of on a cellular level, like you said, being able to feel it and experience it rather than just, knowing about it, I think is a very long journey.
I think where we go wrong a lot in our society is that, when I looked at health at every size, to me, it seemed like external actions that I needed to change in order to kind of recultivate this lifestyle that was more balanced. But the reality is that it's essentially recovery. It's like addiction recovery. It's mental health recovery. It's anything but just outside actions. And so, I'm willing to invest in therapy to go I do a lot of things to take care of my mental health, and it's complicated and nuanced and not linear. And for some reason, I thought that healing this relationship with my body and food would somehow be linear and simple. And here you go, Jess, here's like another map, because that's what we always want. We want the quickest way. And for me, it has become very apparent that they are one and the same. Very nuanced, very difficult, very slow, a reconnection, non-linear. And I'm looking forward to finding balance eventually, but I'm not there yet, but I know that I'm working on it, and that feels really good to me.
Yeah. And it is really just such a slow process. I think diet culture teaches us that, you just take this plan and you do it and your life is transformed. I feel like that's the narrative that we get sold about, like anything to do with food in our bodies in diet culture. So I think it's only natural. And I experienced this myself too when I first discovered intuitive eating. I was like, great, done. Now I have the book, I have the plan, I have the thing, I'm going to do it, and it'll be real easy. And it was like years before I could actually fully like sink into it and fully trust it and fully feel like my body and my mind were reconnected and I could trust myself to eat anything I wanted. Like that was not just reading the book and knowing the concepts was not the quick path there that diet culture had told me.
There is no quick path. There is no quick path in life. And I think that as I am rediscovering spirituality and working on relationships with my family and going through childhood trauma and working with my body, like there are no quick paths through anything. And we do what we can do. And I want to make sure people know that it's great to take the time and space to really delve in and uncover the very, very tiny threads that lie underneath everything else. But sometimes we also don't have the mental bandwidth or the capacity to do that at a certain moment in our life. And that's okay too. Like there's no wrong way to do it. I think about that a lot. It takes a lot of energy and a lot of mental space for me to even look at my connection with my body and food and my mind. And, that's not always an option for people all the time. So I guess my advice is just be gentle with yourself, and wherever you're at, it's okay. It's okay.
And yeah, I think the thing is too about it, like having a fraught relationship with food and your body can help you cope in some sense, in some cases, in some instances with, what else is going on in your life. And so those things become coping mechanisms for kind of bigger, traumatic, difficult things that you don't have an easy coping skill to use for. And taking away the food and body obsession at that point might actually be, more harmful, because then what are you relying on? That, then what are the coping skills that you have? So I think it's like you have to get to a point in recovery where you can start looking at those things and they're not like this lifeline for you, where you can start to let go because you have something else that's your lifeline.
Well, I really do believe that coping mechanisms, I think a lot of times now that we're talking more about self-care and mental health in general, we're talking about in very simplistic ways in society in general, but self-care gets thrown around, mental health gets thrown around. I think we like to differentiate coping mechanisms into good and bad categories, and I'm just going to say that doesn't fucking exist. Coping mechanisms, whatever the fuck they are, survival techniques, they are there to keep you alive. And there's no such thing as a bad or a good one, because the reality is we're all just surviving and we're doing whatever we need to do to survive. So the choice comes when you're like, okay, maybe I don't like this particular action that I'm taking because it makes me feel some negative way. I would like to find a way to replace it with something else that feels a little bit better. Like that's the transition. It's not, I just really want to be careful that we don't ever dive into like, get rid of using food as a coping mechanism. Because first, it will always be. Food is life. It's nutrition. It is part of our history, culture, family, everything. So I just want to be very clear that it's not a bad thing. And what I'm talking about when I'm talking about healing my connection with food in my body is I'm talking about finding a place of neutrality for myself where I am just allowed to be and trust myself. And that's mental more than anything.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I want to say with that too, like, I also don't usually talk about using food as a coping mechanism, in a demonizing way, like emotional eating, quote unquote, which gets such a, has such a negative valence in our culture. I actually talk a lot about like using dieting as a coping mechanism, using the restriction of food or the effort to like shrink your body as a coping mechanism for, the trauma of diet culture, for one thing. But also like we're told in diet culture that those things, that shrinking your body and that eating quote unquote perfectly is going to bring, happiness, acceptance, success, love, all of these things. And if that's what you're told and your life is feeling kind of out of control, and that's the thing you're grasping onto with the hope that it's going to bring you, acceptance and happiness and love, the desire for and the need for those things, for acceptance and happiness and love, like that's so fundamentally beautiful and necessary and not at all something to demonize. The need underneath it is not something to demonize whatsoever. It's more that we're sold this false narrative of what's supposed to bring us those things. And, that's like, we let go of that when we let go of that,
Right. Okay, good. Yeah, I thought we were on the same page. I just wanted to be super clear because I do, when you're in a lot of different communities that are all focused on different kinds of healings, it's really easy to quickly dive into like categorizing good and bad ways to survive. And I think that survival in and of itself, however it looks, is beautiful. So whatever it takes, please keep doing that because the world needs you.
Totally. And including this thing that people deem as emotional eating or using food for comfort, which I think is like a really benign and useful coping mechanism, actually, that, we demonize because of diet
delicious.
Culture. It is delicious.
And wonderful. And food has saved my life. There's this one footnote. Can I throw this in here really fast?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so there's this one footnote that could have been a chapter, but I was talking, so I have a lot of mental coping skills that I have learned through therapy, through working in mental health, through spiritual thought leaders that I love, and I also have medication that I take I've been very fortunate to find a combination that's been working for like over 6 years. And one day I was having just a complete mental breakdown, essentially. And I have this checklist. I talk about having a support system that is a 5-legged stool, so 5 different things that you can always rely on. And I tried all of the ones that were available to me. My partner was at work. My mom was out of town. They weren't available. The meds weren't working. The calming techniques weren't working. Nothing was working. I walked myself through some cognitive behavioral therapy. Nothing was working. And I was starting to lose it completely. Like it just felt really out of control. And what I ended up doing, I can't exactly remember how I jumped to this. It was a very small jump, but I was like, okay, I'm going to go make some crepes. And I used to work at a creperie. So I love crepes. I know how to make them.
So you can do it in like the cool way with the little spatula and like.
Oh, I'm not that cool. Perfect. No, you swirl it around in the front pan.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I'm not that cool, but I have an understanding of how to make them and I enjoy making them. And like, I think I see their limited potential. So I went into the kitchen and I made crepes from scratch, which is very simple, and then made them the way I love them. And then I ate them. And it was a combination of a lot of things. It was a hands-on creative project. Ultimately, cooking and baking is, there was intention. It was self-care. It was soothing to be in the kitchen. It was delicious. It sedated me. It literally saved my life that day, those crepes. And I told my therapist about this and she was like, Jess, that is so beautiful. And I hope you always remember that. And so literally what some other person might say is an unhealthy habit for whatever fucking reason, literally kept me and my spirit and my body and my life on this earth. It saved my life. I was going that deep. And so I just want to, that's a little footnote, but I feel so infinitely grateful for that moment of I'm going to make crepes because that was what I needed that day. And here I am, still kicking and screaming. And it's great.
And I feel so grateful for it too, because I'm so glad you're here. Like, I'm so glad you're sharing this with me and with us and the world,
If you're having a hard time, maybe, I don't know, maybe go make some pear apple brie crepes. They're amazing.
That sounds amazing. So delicious. And yeah, so I mean, like you said, there's so many elements to food, right? To making food, to nourishing yourself with food, like to giving yourself that self-care. And it's not just about like demonizing quote unquote emotional eating is one of my pet peeves, because I feel like it misses all of that nuance and all of those purposes that food serves in our lives, because food is not just about nutrition. It's not just about vitamins and fiber and whatnot. Like it's about connection and nourishment in the sense of like taking care of yourself and allowing yourself to literally like stay here, be on this earth, be, surviving. Like we would not be here without food, and we need to be immensely grateful to food for just, all the day-to-day ways that it keeps us alive.
Have you ever watched, I'm trying to think of what it's called, Michael Pollan, the author, he has a Netflix series, a 4-parter. Have you watched it?
I don't think so. I remember thinking I should but I was like, it feels like homework and I think I'm going to hate it. So
I don't know you intimately, Christy. So I don't know if you'll hate it or not, but it is so great.
Oh, okay. Maybe this is a different one that I'm thinking of then. Is this about cooking?
Yes. So
okay,
each episode on Netflix, there's fire, water, air, and then, oh my God, how can I not remember the fourth one? Anyways, it's on Netflix. I just highly suggest that everybody watches it because it is just so fascinating. Of course, the air was my favorite part because I'm a baker. And so it was about bread as a source of life and how it happened. And it's just really fascinating. He really breaks down everything we're talking about in a global way, and it's beautiful. So if you want to watch something amazing about food, I would highly recommend it. We're gonna find it and you're gonna link it below.
Yes, I'll put it in the show notes. That'll be amazing.
Okay.
Oh, that's so good. I love it. He's like such a fraught character for me because when I first started out writing about food and nutrition, he was kind of like my guru, like the days of the omnivore's dilemma. And I was really bought into that version of diet culture that was like, quote unquote, real food and sustainability, but like, so many classist undertones and so much moralization about food and kind of, obesity epidemic, quote unquote, rhetoric thrown in there. But I feel like he's evolved too, like he's evolved in a different direction, and his understanding of people's relationships with food and cooking, that part of it I think is so beautiful.
I just looked it up. It's called Cooked and it's on Netflix. And I can't say that I watched it with everything. I watch everything with like a hypercritical lens. So I'm sure that I was watching it with that lens somewhat. But what I took from it was how universally powerful food is historically, now, and in the future. And it just it took it to a scientific level also of just like the beauty of what happens when you ferment bread, so I don't know, throwing that out there, people should watch it. It's great.
I love that. I feel like that stuff too, like that actually was a huge part of my own recovery as well, was like working in food magazines and getting interested in like the nuances and the science behind like why food does what it does and tastes like how it tastes like, and how we get from raw ingredient to cooked meal and the development of flavors and all that stuff. Like I could really geek out on that, and it gave me such an appreciation for food as this pleasurable thing. I think like when you're in diet culture, when you're really trying hard to restrict, it just strips all the pleasure away from everything to do with food. And like, like so many dieters too, my relationship with food became like try to restrict, and then binge, and then hate myself for binging and beat myself up, and then, wash, rinse, repeat. So like having this element of pleasure kind of brought back in, and having, being able to say like, just like forget about all that, but like, how delicious is this? Or like, how amazing is this that like these bacteria bring us delicious bread, like that part was just so cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's a really important element of healing. And actually that sort of ties into something else I wanted to ask you about with the book, which was, you talked about this kind of swing of the pendulum from the side of dieting and diet culture to what you call Donutland, like, really bringing back all the delicious foods that were forbidden on diets, and, sort of going far in that direction of just like feeling, and then ultimately sort of feeling a little out of control with that. and, starting to find your way back to a middle ground. So I'm curious to like dive into that and explore a little bit, because I talk a lot about that too when I talk about intuitive eating, that there's this like very necessary sort of step out or swing out of diet culture to this, like, I call it the honeymoon phase of just like, yeah, I get to eat this and that and this and that, all these things that were forbidden. And you sort of go to town on the foods that were forbidden. And it can feel scary and destabilizing when you're first, if you still have that diet mentality with you, it can feel like, oh my God, is this ever going to end? And this feels bad. But I, always try to reassure people that it's actually a really important element of healing, and that it's a good thing,
Absolutely. So I didn't come up with that pendulum. That is totally credited to Deb Burgard, who works with the Association for Size Diversity in Health and works with Health at Every Size as well.
Yeah,
and
previous podcast guest also. She's really
brilliant. Been doing this work a long time. So this is obviously a very simplified version. So please know that Deb knows a lot more about this. But this was explained to me through Dana of Be Nourished as well. And something that Deb kind of talks about is this pendulum. On the right side, we have Dietland, the diet industry, which is where I lived the majority of, my adult life. And then what ends up happening when we find out that that's a scam and a sham and everything horrible, is we tend to swing 180 degrees on this pendulum to Donutland, which is the opposite of Dietland. And it's a place where the beaches are made out of macaroni and cheese, and you can like lounge on chairs that are made of like Napoleon puff pastry, and it's amazing and delicious and beautiful, and nothing's off limits. And I definitely made that switch. And I know that we've been talking about how my relationship with food and my body is fraught, but people who are much smarter than me, who are brilliant and have done a lot of research on this, say, and I believe them, and I know this, I think, on a different level in mental health, that that's a completely healthy thing to do. Mm-hmm. Like, coming from an ex-Mormon, I will just let you know that like swinging the full 180 degrees to a club girl every night, that is a natural, healthy reaction.
Yes. Oh my God.
It just happens, and you have to, and it just is what it is, and that's fine. And so I think what gets a little tricky is that there's nothing wrong with Donutland. There's nothing wrong with eating whatever the fuck you want to eat, as much as you want to eat, whenever you want to eat. And I want to make sure that everyone knows that they are allowed to like buy a house, like a mansion in Donutland, and live there forever if it makes them happy. I've been living in Donutland for years since I realized, that basically, this diet industry, such bullshit. And so I've been living there, and only recently, it's taken me years, have I started to realize, as I've kind of been able to have the space to dig a little deeper, that a lot of my food choices felt autonomous and independent, but really, if I looked where I didn't want to look, they were reactions to previously being in Dietland. So they weren't really like independent, neutral, trusting myself choices. They were reactionary choices, kind of the middle finger, fuck you to Dietland. And that's fine. But then there was this part of me that was like, I kind of want to get to a place where it's neither a fuck you or the opposite. It's just because I'm like embodied in myself and making a decision based on nothing other than neutrally what is best for me right now. And I haven't been able to find really that spot. That's something that Deb, I believe, calls discernment. So you have the 3 Ds, you have Dietland, you have Donutland, and then in the middle somewhere on that pendulum is discernment. And I think it can creep very quickly into problematic territory when we start to talk about discernment. Because when I first heard discernment, I was like, oh, that's another bullshit lifestyle change you're trying to sell me. Like, nice try. I'm smarter than that now. I don't think so.
Yeah, it kind of seems like intuitive eating used as a diet, or, the mindful eating diet. Yeah.
And people do market those things that way. And so it's really dangerous. And so, but the reality is that we can pull ourselves back from all of that, I think. and learn to trust ourselves. And that's what it comes down to. And so obviously, I think it's really important to remember that we're all human and that we are always on a journey. So, maybe we're in Dietland, we swing 180 to Donutland, we stay there for years, decades, the rest of our life, whatever, that's cool. Maybe we take a vacation from Donutland and like slide somewhere down the scale and go back. Who knows where we end up? That's totally up to the person, because you get to do, as long as you don't harm others, like do whatever you want to do with your life. It is yours, live it. For me, I would really like to have the option to make decisions that are not reactionary if I want to. So that's my goal. It's such a weird goal, but that's my goal.
No, it's a totally understandable goal. I feel like I have that goal myself in many areas of life too. Like I've experienced, rebellious eating, rebellious ways of living in the past. And it really was like a necessary reaction to whatever the sort of oppressive, strictures that I was in previously. And then after a certain point of moving through that, I was kind of like, all right, but I don't want to be thinking about this oppressive way of doing things and living in reaction to that for the rest of my life. Like, can I just drop even thinking about that and sort of be organized around some different principles that have nothing to do with oppression or rebellion against it?
Yeah. And I think we're all somewhere on there. And I know this sounds so maybe a little hokey to people or non-committal, but there's just not good or bad. Like maybe I want to live in maybe next year I decide I want to live in Donutland again because I miss it. I really want to be there all the time, and that's fine too. And even, okay, this is controversial. I'm going to regret it once I say it. Just kidding. I don't even think that Dietland is bad, because I think that when we're in Dietland, we are searching for control and validation and worthiness, and we're searching for something, right? And it fills that need for whatever amount of time we're there. And then we learn that we don't want to be there anymore. And so then we keep going on our journey. And so I think, we move around the board on the pendulum all the time. And that's normal and natural. And it's all okay, because it all serves a purpose. But for me, and it all depends on the person, where they're at, their life goals, their history, right? Like I have a different history than other people. I have privilege in some ways and all these different factors. For me, where I'm at right now at this current moment talking to you today is I would like to be able to trust the world and myself enough to know that I'm going to be okay, because I've never been okay. I've been raised in scarcity, lived scarcely. I want to know that the world is okay and that I'm okay, and I can trust myself to make neutral decisions that are best for me. And that's a hell of an order. Like that's a huge ask. That's a lifelong journey. I'm working on it, but that's where I want to be headed. And so that's where I'm at right now.
I love that. I think it's, such a good point that Dietland serves its purpose. Like, I think for me, I like to sort of distinguish between the intrapersonal Dietland, that like individuals can buy into that or like live their lives governed by diets, and that serves, a real coping purpose, like we were talking about with coping skills. But then the external diet culture, which is the thing that I would like to smash to the ground, like the thing that I think is harming people and causing a lot more problems than that it solves. But it's like, the search for coping mechanisms is a good thing and is a valid thing, but like, let's not have the coping mechanism that everybody reaches for automatically be dieting, because we know that like it's just bullshit and it doesn't work, and it hurts more than it helps.
It was created to harm. And so I absolutely agree. Absolutely. And this kind of brings us really quickly to my differentiation too, that's something else that's changed for me. I see the same pendulum swing. I used to talk a lot about body love. That was the term I used. And so officially we have been writing online. April 2018 is 6 years.
Oh my God.
And so 6 years ago, Bopo on Instagram didn't exist. It was this very interesting time in fat activism. But body love was kind of the term that I clung to. It spoke to me. I used it. I preached it. I used it in everything. It resonated for what I needed it to be. And since then, in the last year or so, maybe a couple years, I've changed to body liberation. And that's really what I believe in. That's the term that resonates with me now. See how we make progress and change and learn as humans, fluidity, body liberation. And it kind of, I think to me, falls in line with the conversation we were just having about diet culture and Donutland, where we have self-hatred and loathing. And then we hear about body love. And then we're like, oh my God, yes, thank you so much for telling me I can love my body. But what I've watched kind of happen is this obsession with hating our body simply hop, skips, and jumps into an obsession with loving our body. And there's still obsessions. And so I see the obsession, and I've been part of this. I participated in it. I've promoted it. I take full ownership of that. But this obsession of learning to love your body. And sometimes that's not always possible, because this is a lifetime journey. We live in a world where there's this thing called oppression and marginalization that are outside influences that we cannot personally control. And so it's kind of this body love thing to me started to feel like another standard that I could not perform enough for, I couldn't achieve. And then I started to feel shitty about myself for not loving my body enough. And I was like, oh, what is this? What are we doing here? So I guess, in the end of my book, I kind of talk about body liberation as this alternative idea. And it's exactly what we've just talked about. It's that middle ground where we're free from everything around us. We're free to live our best from our old self-hatred learning. We're free from obsessing and trying to meet someone else's body love standards. We're free from our own reactions to all of the above. And we are able to use our body as a way to be liberated and live the best life that we can, whatever that looks like for the individual. It's different for everyone. So it's a very vague description, but I think it has to be because liberation is different for everyone.
I love that. And that term resonates so much with me too. I've actually started including it in my tagline for the podcast because I feel like it really captures the spirit of what this is about. It's not, to me, it's not about body love either, because that is just that swinging of the pendulum and a sort of an impossible standard for so many people to achieve. And as I've learned to accept my own body and, as someone with so much privilege in the world, not having to walk around with marginalization and experiences of microaggressions every day, I have had a much easier time with this. But, in my recovery from diet culture and stopping trying to shrink my body, stopping dieting, stopping trying to eat quote unquote perfectly and whatever, stopping exercising for instrumental purposes, I've come to this place with my body where I'm grateful for what it does and feel good in it. Sometimes I have these moments of connecting with it through various formats like yoga or taking a walk or just having sex or giving a hug or, these moments where I'm appreciative of being in my body. But I'm not jumping around yay, my body's amazing, taking pictures of myself and posting them online. I'm not, it's kind of a quiet, I
love it. But I totally know what you mean.
Everybody's different. And that's, I'm much more of a don't want a lot of pictures of myself out there, but it's much quieter. It's the slow burn sort of love, to me, it reminds me of my relationship history because I used to be in these really terrible, toxic, sort of dramatic relationships where it was I was trying to fix someone or they were trying to fix me or, there was a lot of extremes in the relationship and it never really worked. But it felt so there's this big hit of when you landed someone who I thought I couldn't get or got someone to commit that I thought was a commitment phobe or whatever, these sort of silly patterns that a lot of us, I think, probably have fallen into. And then, the difference between that and a relationship that's really solid and that's not fraught with those extremes, it's such a different sort of feeling in the high, the highs are not as high and the lows are not as low, but it's this slow burn, it's this steady kind of my therapist described it like a radiator sort of heat versus a fire, like a bonfire,
or a house on fire.
Or a house on fire. Yeah, more like it actually.
I've been in those relationships too, for sure. I think the other differentiation for me too is that I think a lot of this obsession around loving our body tends to lean towards expanding the definition of what's beautiful, right? So it's like kind of trying to like pry open the beauty standard that's been so exclusive and say, fit me in there too. And really, ultimately, that's not what I think we want. I think we want to say, I'm going to use my energy to not pry open this exclusive, systemic, forever old standard that was created to harm me, but rather I would like it to have nothing to do with my value at all. And that doesn't mean that we can't think that we're beautiful people. Like, beauty is in a million different ways, but not needing to fit a standard or be included in a standard. I don't want to expand the definition of what's pretty. I want people to feel liberated in their bodies and in their lives so that they can have that human connection, experience self-love, look in the mirror and be like, oh yeah, you do look good, from a place of just being like, I'm awesome. My body's awesome. This dress is awesome. I feel myself, kind of removing ourselves from that beauty standard altogether and not having that be the thing that determines our value. Because there will always be exclusion no matter how far we pry it open. And so that's the difference for me as well.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I feel like that sort of narrowness of it, even if we pry it open, that's such a good metaphor too, because it's like, there's still this sort of tightness around the edges. And even if we pry it open enough that like one type of person can slip in there, it's still this sort of shell that's clamped around people in this narrow way, and that's never going to allow everybody to be a part of it. It's still going to be exclusionary no matter what, even if we're able to pry it open and get a few more types of people in there.
Yeah, I do feel like visibility is important. So marketing is obviously where we see all of this exclusivity and the pretend prying and inclusivity of plus size models, which do not represent the majority of plus people. But at the same time, it's like it's such a complicated conversation to have. We won't dive too deep into it because this is kind of the other side of what I do. That's not necessarily food psych related, but I do think that visibility is important as well. And I do see, there are studies that have been done that show that tolerance, kindness, empathy all increase when we are shown diversity of bodies. And so in a very evil, necessary way, having that visibility within our fashion industry, even our beauty industry, as weird as that sounds, is important too. But that's why I really love that we have social media and the platforms that we do now, because we're really on this precipice of a time where we have more visibility than ever before when it comes to who, we don't have newspapers deciding who gets to be on the front. And that's a good thing.
Absolutely. Visibility is such an important piece of this. And I think you're right, like prying open the beauty standards a little bit to allow more diversity, more types of bodies in has its place. Like, because it's that, that's where maybe some, like a young kid who's not exposed to social media yet, or not, doesn't have the wide range of choice of influences that they're going to absorb, but they catch some ad on a billboard somewhere or whatever that's like, oh, this person looks like me. Maybe that does have, some impact. But the bigger impact really is that sort of proliferation of different choices and representations that we create, that people in the world create, instead of some gatekeepers creating.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I love it. The last thing I wanted to ask you about is like your relationship with exercise and movement, which is sort of a piece with this discussion about food and like the swinging from Dietland to Donutland. In the same way, there's kind of a swing, I think, with a lot of us that happens where if exercise was used for body shrinking purposes, that's something to kind of go far, far away from when you first give up, your participation in diet culture, and, swinging to the other side of like really letting go of intentional movement, I think is a very important part of the process for a lot of people. And I know that was something that you've had to go through as well. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts around that.
Yeah, I think it's all very similar, this pendulum thing that we do. And so I did an experiment where I was like, you know what? I'm not my entire life since I was a child, I think I've played like every sport except for rugby. I don't know. Like, it feels like that's the only thing I haven't done. But all of those things like, thank you, Mom, for keeping me so involved in our community. And like, I was homeschooled for part of my childhood. And so she was really incredible in giving us these opportunities. And I think that a lot of these sports activities fall underneath that umbrella, but also with the knowledge that my body was broken, feeling like it was broken, it was also all felt like penance. And so, since I was a little kid, movement was never anything other than an apology. It was, I'm trying. It was a punishment. So I have not had a healthy relationship with movement ever. And that's an even harder one than food for me, because I am stubborn as shit. And I will not participate in things that I feel are obligatory. And now I'm realizing that is a reaction, and so I'm doing this whole dance again. I'm excited because Bevan Brand-Landingham is a friend of mine, and she's touring the country with this amazing aerobics class called Fat Kid Dance Party. And it is phenomenal. I've seen it in action. She does medium impact, and you can bump it up, you can bump it down, you can do whatever. Like, it is literally for every single body. And she's doing a series of videos soon that will have chair options, and just like, it's really inclusive in the best ways possible. And it's coming to Tucson really soon, and I'm going. I'm really excited. And here's what I think that people don't realize, that, hey, movement instructors out there, just going to let you have this hot tip. You are our therapists when it comes to moving our bodies. And when we walk into spaces, there has to be trust, because we all have shit around our bodies. And it's not a walk in, work out, and leave. It's so much more than that. And so I have only been able to go into movement spaces where that trust is there for me. And then the experiences are like church, right? Because it's so much more than just the movement. I'm looking forward to Bevan's class, because I think it's going to be an incredibly safe space, first of all, a fun space. If you feel awkward, you yell out that you feel awkward, and then everybody cheers for you. That's like an actual thing they do. It's great.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
That so much.
So I'm really looking forward to having Bevan as my movement therapist for the day, and we'll see how that goes. But I'm realizing what I need now, which is that trust. I think that a lot of yoga practitioners, maybe they're just in my circles a lot, but I think that's something here in Tucson. I have a friend named Jennifer, and she's also a therapist, actually. She's a yogi and a therapist. She's training all of her students on how to make it that therapeutic type of space so that people can come and heal their relationships with movement in their bodies, because it's so important. It's more than a step class,
Totally. It is.
Do people still do step classes? Are step classes still a thing?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I hope not, because they're so punishing, I mean, if you like step classes, good on you, but it's not my cup of tea.
I feel like things could be really fun if you had like the appropriate 80s workout gear.
That's true. Yeah.
And like some really fun gyms.
Anachronistic, like everything 80s, like the music and the workout gear in the gym.
Yeah. Bevan's kind of like Richard Simmons, but if Richard Simmons wore red glitter lipstick and a huge bow in his hair, and then made everybody high five and clap if they were feeling awkward. So I'm really excited. Maybe I can like live some of those dreams when she comes.
She sounds incredible. I will link to her in the show notes too, so people can find that, because I'm always looking for movement resources to give people. And I feel like I always end up just pushing them towards the same like yoga people, because that's who's kind of doing this like safe type of movement practice online.
She's doing some home workout videos, so make sure you link it.
Oh, amazing. I will. That's so great. Such a great resource. I'm going to try it too. Oh, well, I could talk to you forever, Jess. I have like a million more questions I want to ask you about this book, but we'll have to do a part 3 at some point so we can delve into like your next phase, whatever the next book is and the next chapter of life and all of that.
You're so kind. Thank you.
Always. You're always welcome. But thank you so much for sharing everything you did. Thank you so much for just being you and writing this book. And I think people are going to love it.
Thank you so much, Christy.
So that's our show. Thanks again so much to Jes Baker for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. This episode was brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to make peace with food, become an intuitive eater, and break free from diet culture for good, learn more and sign up at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message, because who doesn't, by sharing this episode on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or your favorite podcast platform. You can subscribe to it and make sure your friends and family are subscribed at christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. I love the Apple platforms because subscribing on one of those helps bring us up in the podcast rankings so that more people discover us, and so that we can help counteract all the diety stuff in the top 50 podcasts, because there is a lot of it. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we discussed, plus a full transcript, head over to christyharrison.com/154. That's christyharrison.com/154. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. And if you're looking for some practical tips to get started on your own anti-diet journey, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Head over to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. A big thanks to our editors and engineers at Podcast Fast Track, and to my Food Psych Programs team, our community manager and content development associate, Ashley Saruya, our administrative assistant, Sarah Thompson, and our transcript assistant, Megan Saichi, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Meredith Noble, and the music you're hearing behind me now is by a band called AWOL, and the track is called Food, used under the Creative Commons license. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.
Stupid or scared, no work in the kitchen now. Who put you there in that perfect